There are no bodies at the Titanic. Well, no, you won't find any bones. At that depth, the bones break down very quickly into a fluid. Anyone who has looked through the wreck has found pairs of shoes. The sinking of the Titanic is one of the few tragedies that everyone everywhere knows about. Despite the fact that the RAS Titanic sank on April 14, 1912, it wasn't until 1985 that the wreckage of the sinking ship was discovered off the coast of Newfoundland. Even though the ship had been at sea for so long that most of it had died, divers were able to save and keep a number of amazing and even scary things. Come with us as we look at 15 spooky things that were recovered from the Titanic. Hello and welcome to Info Plus. Let's get going. Number 1. Human remains including bones and teeth. Many bodies were recovered from the ocean during the recovery attempts following the Titanic's sinking. But not all of them were able to be identified. Because of their poor state, some of the remains were beyond identification. Some of these unidentified remains were never claimed by family members, but many were buried in cemeteries near the places where they were found. For example, in Halifax, Nova Scotia, a number of victims were buried in the Fairview Lawn Cemetery. Some of the remains were sent back to the place where they were found to be buried, but many of the remains were never claimed and were buried in pits with no markers. The identification of the remains was challenging and not always successful. In many cases, the remains were in a state of decomposition, and the identification was based on clothes, personal things, or other physical traits. There were cases of incorrect identification in addition to cases of remains that were never identified. Some remains would be mistaken because of misunderstanding or a lack of information, which would lead to families getting the wrong remains or burying the wrong person. This caused more pain and suffering for the families who had already lost loved ones. In recent years, improvements in DNA technology have allowed for the identification of some of the victims' remains from the Titanic. In 2007, 2 victims' remains were taken out of Fairview Lawn Cemetery in Halifax and identified using DNA tests. Many of the Titanic disaster victims were never identified, and their families never knew what happened to them. This is a tragic fact. It serves as a reminder of the terrible tragedy that occurred that fateful night. Number 2. A necklace made of 18-karat gold. On April 15, 2017, Premier Exhibitions opened Titanic, the artifact exhibition at the Luxor Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. This was to mark the 105th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. A locket made of 18-karat gold that belonged to a guest named Virginia Estelle McDowell Clark was one of the many things on show. Virginia and her husband Walter boarded the Titanic to go back to their home in Los Angeles. They went to Europe for their late vacation and couldn't wait to get back home so they could celebrate their son's 2nd birthday with him. The Clarks were first-class passengers on board the ship, and a curator for Premier Exhibitions, Alexandria Klingelhofer, said that they had cut their trip short to go home. Like most of the other passengers, Virginia and Walter probably thought they were perfectly safe on this enormous ocean ship and would be reunited with their son in no time. After all, the ship was promoted as being completely unsinkable, and most passengers didn't question this before getting on board. Virginia was the only one of the Clark family to make it back home, and only because her husband gave his life. When the ship hit an iceberg in the northern Atlantic Ocean, Virginia was alone in her cabin. When she felt the impact, she went straight to Walter, who was playing cards with some other men in the room. He didn't seem to be bothered by the waves that the crash must have caused. When the couple understood what had occurred, they ran to the lifeboats, hoping that they could both get to safety. As we all know from the movie, women and children were allowed to board the lifeboats before anyone else. This was also true in real life. Virginia and Walter were separated, just like Rose and Jack, while he made sure his wife was on the lifeboat and headed to safety. They had hoped to be reunited someday, but it never happened. Number 3. A doll's head. According to its current owner, a doll that survived the Titanic and was recovered from the ocean floor 65 years later is being sold at auction again. Only the head of Eva Hart's favorite doll remains. She had to leave the rest of the doll in her room when she ran away from the ship as it was sinking. Captain Abel Federico Nogueres of the shipping company Argent Bell discovered the doll 41 years ago, 2,000 meters underground, halfway between Southampton, UK, and New York City. He kept it until his death 15 years later. Teresa Martin, a collector from Spain's far southwest town of Huelva, got in touch with Eva Hart and worked out a deal that allowed her to keep the doll. Eva passed away in 1996. She never got to see her doll again, but she was happy that it had been discovered. When asked about her experience on the Titanic and how she managed to stay alive after the opulent ocean ship sank on its maiden journey, Eva always made mention of the doll. The head of this creepy doll was pulled from the bottom of the Atlantic by a sailor in 1977 before the doll was recovered. At first, the figure made of china that was pulled up from a depth of 6,561 feet was thought to be a rock. But when the person who found it learned it was a doll's head, he kept it with him until his death in 1992. The ceramic head is the same shape as the Schöne and Hofmeister 1906 mold, and this rare doll is known to have survived the sinking of the Titanic. The head spent many years in a museum in Spain. In 2018, it was sold on an auction site for €650. Number 4. Vials of perfume. The RMS Titanic Incorporated team made another amazing discovery when they discovered these perfume bottles in a closed pouch. A rescue expert named Dick Barton said that they didn't know what they had found until they got to the top. When Barton and his team opened the pouch in question, they discovered that it held a whole lab's worth of Edwardian perfume. Researchers think that the 62 perfume bottles were from a first-class customer named Adolf Saffold, who was 47 years old. One servant left the ship, but he didn't take the samples with him. He was one of the lucky ones who made it to safety. Because of this discovery, Alt perfume would make a scent called Legacy 1912, which is said to smell like soft lemon and neroli, blushing rose, and warm smooth amber. Number 5. The keys to a cabin that were never found. A set of keys to a cabin that was never found were also recovered from the Titanic, which was yet another shocking discovery. This is unexpected because it raises questions about the fate of the passengers who occupied that cabin and what actually happened to them. The keys would suggest that the cabin was occupied at the time of the sinking, and the fact that it was never found suggests that the cabin and its people were lost in the disaster. It is possible that the keys were recovered from the wreckage or from the belongings of a survivor or victim, but this has not been proven. It's also possible that the cabin wasn't occupied at the time of sinking, but the keys were still found and the cabin was never recovered. It's important to note that many of the ship's cabins and areas were never found. It's possible that these areas were fully destroyed during the sinking or simply lost to the ocean. The discovery of keys to a cabin that was never found would bring up a lot of questions and might lead to new information about the disaster. Number 6. JH initials on a pair of gold cufflinks. Because they offered a real-life link to the passengers or crew members on board the Titanic, these were considered important finds. The fact that the cufflinks are made of gold and have names on them suggests that they belong to a wealthy or important person who was on board the ship. Many questions about the owner and fate of these cufflinks have been raised by their discovery. For example, were they rich business people or crew members with a lot of power? Did they have any loved ones who were also on board the ship? What did they think and feel as the ship was sinking? Answering these questions would provide a much more human viewpoint on the entire disaster and give us a glimpse into the personal lives of the passengers and crew members on board the Titanic. Also, the discovery of these cufflinks was important because of how they fit into the history of the disaster. The Titanic was considered a grand and opulent ship, and the fact that these gold cufflinks were recovered from the wreckage serves as a reminder of the wealth and status of its passengers, as well as the ship's grandeur. Number 7. A pair of leather boots belonging to a member of the crew. These boots were a shocking discovery because they put a human face on the disaster and remind us of the crew members who lost their lives trying to save passengers. The boots suggest that the crew member was on duty at the time of the sinking and was probably helping with the escape. It's possible that the crew member's remains or the wreckage were where these boots were recovered. The discovery of this item was a reminder of the sacrifices and bravery of the crew members during the disaster. It also gave a glimpse into the conditions on board the ship and the practical considerations of the crew members who were trying to save lives. Last but not least, the discovery of a pair of leather boots belonging to a crew member is a strong reminder of the human cost of the disaster and gives a personal link to the crew members who lost their lives while trying to save others who were on the Titanic. Number 8. The deck bell went off to warn people. A significant artifact from the Titanic disaster is the deck bell that Frederick Fleet rung. The bell was used in the ship's crow's nest. It would be rung when there was an obstacle ahead, like the iceberg that the Titanic hit on April 15, 1912. The bell was later given to the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, after being recovered from the wreckage of the Titanic in the early 1990s by RMS Titanic Incorporated, the company that had the right to rescue the wreckage. The bell is considered an important historical artifact because it is one of the few pieces of equipment left from the crow's nest. It also serves as a physical reminder of the tragic events that occurred on the night of the sinking. The bell is also a reminder of what the crew did to help prevent the disaster and what the lookouts did to tell the bridge about the obstacle ahead.